Good morning, gardeners. Tomatoes are one of the most popular crops among home gardeners, and rightfully so. Tomatoes come in thousands of different varieties, ranging from size, shape, color, and tastes. Tomatoes are relatively easy to grow. Whether you have a small space or a bigger garden, you can get a lot of them if you do things right. In this video, I'm going to go over my 6 tomato garden mistakes that I have personally made and had the biggest effects on how well my tomatoes grew. With that said, I'm happy you're here. Let's get into the video. The first mistake is not pruning your tomato plants correctly. Pruning your tomato plants helps with airflow, preventing diseases, and helps your tomato plant focus its energy on tomato production rather than leaf growth. So there's 3 parts to a tomato plant. There's the main stem, the sun leaf, and these little suckers in between them. Normally the suckers are at a 45 degrees, kind of like an armpit. Tomato plants are susceptible to diseases compared to most other crops, so you want to prune any leaves touching the soil or any suckers that are preventing your tomato plants from getting airflow. And this is especially important if you live in a humid climate. But not all tomato plants need pruning equally. So on my left, I've got a indeterminate tomato plant variety, and on my right, I've got a determinate variety. This is something you guys should know. Let me explain. With the determinate plants, it grows 2 to 4 feet on average and produces all the tomatoes at once and then stops producing. If you grow a determinate tomato plant, you're going to get your tomatoes earlier, but they won't go until the frost. And with the indeterminate, it's indeterminate, so you're going to have tomatoes growing all the way until the weather kills it, so your frost, and it grows much taller, much bushier. It'll just keep on growing, keep on giving. With both indeterminate and determinate, you want to prune any leaves that are touching the soil. I prefer up to 6 inches, so from the soil, 6 inches tall. This is mainly just to increase your airflow and prevent any diseases. But for your determinate varieties, that's all you want to do. You just want to prune anything touching the soil and not prune any of the suckers. That's as far as you go. And this is because the determinate variety is designed to produce all the tomatoes at once. So if you were to cut off any of the suckers, you're not going to get nearly as big of a harvest. It's more of a hands-off experience. At the front here, I've got a bunch of cherry tomatoes growing. They're the Torringina and the Jasper hybrid varieties. All these tomatoes are very small in size. So I try to keep this plant to a 2 main stem system, and that's just letting 2 suckers grow. If a sucker is left alone, it'll grow into another main stem, which will eventually produce more tomatoes on it. If you have more gardening space, you can let more suckers grow, but I stick to a 2 main stem system because of the garden space. Now for bigger tomato varieties, such as these ones, I prune my tomato plants to a single stem system, and that's just removing all the suckers and letting the tomato plant focus its energy on producing the biggest tomatoes possible. So essentially you'll have fewer tomatoes, but much bigger ones. And you only want to prune the suckers on bigger tomato varieties such as Abe Lincoln or Big Beef. Hopefully I didn't confuse you guys too much. If you guys have any questions at all, leave them in the comments. Now let's move on to mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is not planting deep enough. Tomatoes are rare and they have the ability to produce more roots if you have moist soil in contact with the main stem. This is called adventitious roots. Hopefully I pronounced that right. So if you have the garden depth, you want to bury about 3/4 of the plant in soil, pretty much as deep as you can go. So I've got this 17-inch sprout box garden bed here, and I started my tomato seeds indoors. I got them to grow pretty tall before I transplanted them outdoors. And when I transplant them into this garden bed, I buried them to the very bottom. These tomato plants here will have roots all the way up on the main stem. So this will help your tomato plants absorb nutrients, water retention, and you'll get more tomatoes out of it. And if you're interested, I'll link the sprout box in the description below. So if you've already planted your tomatoes into the garden and you want more roots, you can add more dirt around your main stem and the roots will start growing from here. Mistake number 3 is not fertilizing your tomato plants properly. When it comes to fertilizing your tomato plants, they are hungry little things, but it's not all about nitrogen. Phosphorus is the star player if you want tomatoes. When I first transplant my tomato plants, I add 3 things. I add blood meal for nitrogen, bone meal for phosphorus, and then I either add worm castings and compost. And for all 3 of those, I just add a handful, and then I mix it into the soil at the very bottom of where I'm transplanting. So blood meal is the nitrogen, and that's in charge of the leaf growth. Then you got bone meal, which is the phosphorus, and that's in charge of the flowers and the tomato production. And then the worm castings is to help with essential nutrients to your tomato plant. So this is where most gardeners make a mistake, is they'll keep adding nitrogen because it helps the tomato plant grow. So it'll be very tall, very bushy. But just because your tomato plant is tall and bushy doesn't mean you're going to get more tomatoes. Once the first set of tomato flowers appear, you want to switch over to a higher phosphorus and less nitrogen fertilizer. This will essentially help your tomato plant produce more flowers and overall more tomatoes. So mistake number 4 is improper watering. Proper watering is a good way to avoid blossom end rot and preventing other diseases in your tomato plant. I pretty much water every morning or every evening. You also don't want to water late at night when the sun is going down and the water's not going to dry off your plant. So we just had a rainfall last night. As you can see, both of these barrels are full. So I collect roughly 400 gallons of rainwater on my property, which gives me the ability to water my garden every day. And if you don't have the ability to collect your own rainwater, or you don't want to use as much water, then I would suggest a method called deep watering. I would take my watering can, I'd water my front garden, and then I'd make my way around my whole garden. And by the time I start in this position again, the water has already soaked into the soil. And then the second round of my watering, I'd give my garden a much deeper watering and I'd go around a second go. So what this does is the water will go deeper into the soil on that second go, and it's going to promote your root growth instead of having shallower roots, and it's just overall better for the garden. So deep watering and consistent watering helps with nutrient absorption in the soil. Essentially the calcium, which most of the time will be what causes blossom end rot. It's not actually a calcium deficiency, which some people think. It's just the fact that you're not watering enough. Tip number 5 is not pollinating your flowers. Tomato flowers have both the male and female part, which is what makes it easy to pollinate. Bees and the wind are normally the ones that pollinate your flowers, but sometimes they need a little bit of help. A few times a week, I'll give my tomato plants a little bit of help and I'll self-pollinate the flowers myself. So you can shake your flowers or your plants, but what I like to do is use an electric toothbrush. That's just because the vibrations are more intense. And by self-pollinating your flowers a couple times a week, you can double or even triple the amount of tomatoes each plant can grow. So the final mistake number 6 is planting in too much shade. Tomato plants love sunlight. They can handle all of it, and you want to aim for at least 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. If you can provide more than 6 hours per day, your tomato plants will reward you with sweeter flavors and more tomatoes. So behind me are my cherry tomatoes, and they're the only variety that can handle a little less sun than most tomato varieties. So 6 hours is good enough for it, but if you can provide more, then do so. So if you do have a lot of shade in your garden and you can't get around it, then a smart workaround is to plant your tomato plants in grow bags. And that's just so if you do have shade throughout the day, then you can easily move it around and put it in the sun. So this is a 5-gallon grow bag and I've got 1 tomato plant in it. I wouldn't suggest putting anything more than just 1. And right now my front yard is getting sunshine this early in the morning. So what I can do is I can take this tomato plant, put it into the sunlight. Once the sun moves, something gets shaded out, I can move this into the sunlight even further. So by doing so in a grow bag, I can extend how much sun this tomato plant gets and get a better harvest from it. Well, those were my 6 tomato growing mistakes that I've personally made myself. I'm hoping you guys got some valuable information out of it. I try to keep it short and sweet for you guys. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I think this 15 raised garden bed mistakes up here is one that you guys would like next. See you in the next video. With that said, good evening gardeners, or with that said, good morning gardeners. See you guys in the next video.